shame is, I think it's a mechanism that's natural, and then it can also be utilized as a tool. And Brene Brown talks a lot about shame, and that it doesn't allow for growth to happen. People can't learn. People can't absorb information when they're
down creativity.
Yeah, when they're being shamed.
And then they do. And actually, people that feel shame or shameful, that tends to come out sideways in like alcoholism and abuse and self-harm.
Right, but a certain amount of shame does motivate you to change your behavior. Like, that's why it exists. Right. It's a path forward, and it allows you to remember the errors that you've made so you can make adjustments.
Right, but you think of like the degrees of shame. And how, again, it can be used as a very harmful tool. And again, why do we need to make somebody feel shameful? You can feel regretful,
right?
But shame to me has another whole robe of shame.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It has a whole nother level of ill feeling, or
it's a really it's a very dark sounding. It brings up for me being judged on my worst moments or decisions.
Right.
The things that it's the opposite of pride, right? If you're not proud of an action, you're maybe ashamed of that action.
Right. And then it's also I think we've, as a culture, or maybe even as a species, I'll take it to that level, created a system where, if you don't comply, you're going to feel these horrible things about yourself and not being accepted. And in reality, isn't there a healthier way we can deal with that?
Well, and that's why I brought up who's writing the moral code.
Right.
Because you can create a system like our educational system where we are ranked, and it's a competitively based system. So you're graded for your A's, your B's, your C's. It's completely ranked. So it doesn't allow for someone to make mistakes easily,
right,
without having to internalize a certain amount of shame. And we know that to learn something, you have to make mistakes.
Right.
Like, that's how we learn.
But I think that you bring up the education system and how much shame that imparts on some very impressionable minds, and they carry that with them the rest of their lives. So.
And that system stays in place too in businesses too, where you're ranking your sales force, you're promoting certain people, you're denigrating other people for behavior. Just like, what is the underlying system that creates the existence of shame to be so prevalent? And
that, the other thing that's interesting you bring up is like that culture of reward and punishment, and how it is very pervasive. And not only our corporations, our spiritual, or not, I'm not going to say spiritual, I mean, like our religious affiliations, or and you think how difficult that is to unravel. And I try to do that at the restaurant. And like, I hate the word boss. I hate it; just makes me bristle. But I explained to somebody the other day who, responds in an environment that they've worked in before. So they're responding to me as if they're going to be punished, or they're going to be, and I said to her, the word boss makes me bristle because, number one, it removes accountability from you.
Right.
And it disempowers you. Right. Because you're thinking that, there's one person that's going to be, and it creates some shame. Like, I'm not comfortable making mistakes because I haven't been taught that. Right. I've been taught to, I do something wrong and I get defensive and I feel and that defensive comes from a place of shame, right? It's a place of self-protection, and it's like interesting to me how, we're an impressionable species,
and plus it's exaggerated, exponentialized. I think Monica Lewinsky did a TED Talk.
Yeah, that was amazing.
And it was about the first time her humiliation and shame was projected around the world in real time. And what that did to her as, like a young woman. She was still an intern.
Right.
And, she explained, like, I did what so many other women my age do. I had a crush on my boss.
Right.
And I did inappropriate things. But she was on suicide watch for a year after that happened. Her parents had to watch her all of the time because she was so humiliated and so filled with shame that she didn't think she could stand the pain.
So think about how long it took her to like sort of reconnect with herself and unwind all of that damage that a society that's supposed to support you tore you down, right?
Right.
And no, I heard that TED Talk too. I thought that was really interesting. And then, you talk about as women being in situations where, if something, has happened to you, something inappropriate, somebody has,
you're the one.
What were you wearing? What were you?
Feel
Why
shame.
were you there? When all the accountability gets laid on you as an individual and not the person that has perpetrated, the boundary.
Yeah, and I feel like that's part of our system of incarceration too. Instead of having rehabilitative qualities, instead of allowing people to learn, grow, or maybe treat an addiction or address a mental health disorder, we incarcerate them, and then that is another level of shame.
Yeah, and I guess the shame comes from, I mean, when you break it down, the shame is lack of acceptance, but it goes deeper than that. So you've been taught by a group of people that you should feel shameful. And
you're not
then you
fit
internalize
to be in
it,
society. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then that cycle just it keeps building on itself. Yeah. How do you take the elements of shame apart? How do you bring love back in and accept yourself and accept that we have flaws, that we're human, that is the human condition, and not be so reliant on.
Which goes back to Brene Brown's work on vulnerability, right? I mean, one of the reasons we internalize shame is because we have such a hard time, taking accountability for where we are. Like, yes, I screwed up. Okay, so how am I gonna? What am I gonna do differently from here?
Right.
And understanding that the vulnerability piece is the piece that removes us, extracts us from that shame. And we're not very good as a culture in reinforcing.
No.
Reinforcing so I did screw up. So this is not going to keep me down.
Right.
I'm going to
it's a
glean from it.
Opportunity.
Right. That's easy for us to say too, because we're
not really.
Well, it is.
I mean, I feel like I've had to practice, really hard to accept all the dark places in myself, the shadow sides, like I get the opportunity to look at the places that I'm not proud of.
Right.
I'm like, oh, that's so petty. Why are you feeling all these feelings? And having to, instead of, beat myself more for having those feelings, just go like, okay, like that's human.
Right.
Move beyond that. Don't get trapped in that cycle of feeling shame, wanting to be different, show up differently, have a different response. A lot of times it's all going on in my head.
Right.
None of it comes out of my mouth, but gauging what those thoughts are in my head and being observant of them makes me realize, like, oh, you still have a lot of work to do.
Right. Yeah. No, I said it's easy for us to say because I think we go there.
Oh yeah, we're willing
and
to.
then we push each other as friends. I mean, and we're able to also, I love that term, anamkara, like soul friend.
Yeah,
so we're fortunate enough to have a relationship where we can expose those, dark secrets or the flaws about ourselves,
right.
and we can have a healthy conversation about it.
Right.
And we don't judge each other. We love each other unconditionally, and I think that's the piece that the condition feeds on shame, and shame feeds on condition, right?
Right. So if you change the petri dish, if you actually have relationships that allow you to be human, allow you to be flawed, allow you to make adjustments without shaming, that would be ideal. How do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we do that for the government? How do we do that for business?
But I think
you're running a business in a way that's...
And I think that's you've said something really important on, we want the world to be a better place, right? But we can't start with the world. We have to start
right here.
I
know.
And
it's an inside job.
And it can be frustrating, and it can be, but if we keep showing up for each other, for ourselves, number one, and for each other and for others, it's also, you think we have had and I hate to use the word brainwashed, but conditioned.
Yeah.
In a patriarchal society, and in that you think of religion and corporations, etc. I mean, you can go down a whole.
Yeah, I mean, so much of religion is based on shame.
Right.
I mean, to not want, to not have sexuality,
right.
to, yes, to have to disown parts of yourself to be accepted by, everyone that is gay or bi or transgender. There are very few religions that are welcoming them as whole people.
It's because, and you think about that's very not. I'm not going to say difficult to control, but it's easier for people to. It's easier to control people that comply to a certain set of social acceptability, right? And when in reality, a spiritual tradition, we'll use Christianity, for instance, and you think of of Jesus, who was compassionate and accepting of everybody.
Right.
And that has been twisted. And I think that also goes back to control, and then, the control, creates if you don't comply within that certain set of rules, then, you're...
Well, I think it's a play for power. And so Christianity was manipulated and used for the church to gain power. And you have to control the people by doing that, and shame is one of the ways that was utilized. And I think people are waking up to that more, the more access they have to... when I was a kid, I didn't know any other children that were Jewish. It was almost all Christian. There were Catholics and Protestants and Methodists, but it was a pretty solidly Christian upbringing. And it wasn't until, I was a young adult that I started meeting a much more diverse group of people that had radically different belief systems and took philosophy and took ancient European civilization and took religion classes and really understood what I had been programmed with or conditioned with or just taught, by very well-meaning people, was only one narrow spectrum of what was acceptable.
And we mentioned Christianity, but there are there's all faith-based religions have sort of the same thread that runs through them. When you were talking about how you grew up, and I've discussed this with somebody recently about, we never talked about that. People would go to mass, some people would go to church on Sunday, and we never really talked about that. We never, and I don't know if it was a function of the way my parents were, where they never, I never heard them criticize anybody that was from that practiced a different religion, or they were from a different socioeconomic background or what have you. I never heard any criticisms from them. And then I look at my group of friends, and we never talked about religion.
Right.
It was interesting. It wasn't until I went to college in Texas when one of the first questions people asked me was where I went to church.
Oh,
and I thought that was
wow.
very strange.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just thought it was but you think about, from a social psychology standpoint, when you meet somebody, you're trying to figure out where you fit.
Right,
or where they fit into your hierarchy, and whether you're going to pursue a friendship beyond the superficial conversation.
Well,
right?
And it's also your ego wanting to know if you can be, superior to them, or,
yeah.
I mean, there is that, like, are you of use to me?
Right.
There is, our ego is working, trying to, like, where does this person belong? Yeah.
And then think about what that causes. Like, if you decide, I don't want anything to do with them, then they're feeling shame for not fitting into what and what's wrong with me, rather than saying, wait, you're not open-minded. What you're not accepting me based on some very superficial.
I've been reading Robin Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and she talks about going into college and really loving plants and wanting to learn about plants. Of course, she's a woman, so first they're telling her, you didn't really belong in the sciences because you're a woman. And then she's bringing questions into this institution about, why are the purple...
Right.
The columbine and these asters.
They said you should go to art school.
You should go to art school. When in fact there is a reason why those plants were growing, but she was completely discounted and made to feel ashamed of her natural curiosity and her indigenous heritage as a Native American. Honoring the fact that the plants had spirits and were connected to the earth, that is a living entity. But she went for years and years and years, like, feeling this deep shame about not being good enough or not having the right perspective.
Or looking at the world their way rather than her realizing that there was validity in the question she was asking.
Yeah, and it's taken her decades.
Right. And there was a complementary relationship between those plants in nature, why they were a certain color.
Yeah, complementary colors are the most vivid, and you're trying to attract bees that are attracted to color. It makes total sense. But that question wasn't even allowed to be asked.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we're coming a long way. But it takes persistent. You have to, like, be able to maybe have shame. I mean, are people shaming as a verb, when you're trying to shame someone, to disallow that to penetrate into your core and undermine you? Like, I think that's part of the practice. And if you were a child that, if your parents shamed you repeatedly, like, that is such a deep wound. Or
it's abuse, right? And it changes your neurochemistry,
right?
So then it's hard. I mean, you think, well, it's very easy not to feel these. Why do you feel shame? It's like, a lot of people don't know why they feel it.
Right.
I mean, it's like part of their cellular network now.
Right.
And then going to the depths of understanding when that happened. Right. And then changing it at the cellular level to behave or to interact differently in your environment. So it requires a lot of work and a lot of understanding and a lot of, and just willingness to go there, right?
Right.
And I think we underestimate words and how powerful they are, and
absolutely.
And any trauma, right? Any abuse to the mind or body. I mean, even even surgery. It's traumatic. It's traumatic. I mean, you think of, and in a way, when you think of the research that they're doing about how many words children get exposed to by, I think it's age 2.
Right.
And then you think
directly related to their ability to
learn.
Yeah.
And their IQ. And so that is all tied together. And then you think of a child who's parents are too busy to
talk to them, read to them.
They're exhausted at the end of the day. They have this child that they need to, and this child doesn't get, exposed to those words. Maybe they do. And you think energetically, if there's tension or, any other negative stimulus that the child's exposed to at a very young age.
Right,
and that's carried through. It's hard, I say hardwired. You can change it. You just have to, you can change how you interact with your environment, but it takes a lot of, unwinding.
Yeah, a lot of persistence. And who has the ability to do that? I mean, rarely are we presented with the knowledge, and then you're also starting with a deficit. You're starting with deep-seated doubts that you are not good enough. You have not been given the skills that you might need to even unwind those things.
Right. And then, you're what is like the definition of shame? Like what does that mean? Right. Where does it come from? Why does it inhabit us?
Right. Right.
I mean, all of these.
And why do we utilize that? I mean, why is it part of the origin story?
Right.
They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden in Christianity for eating from the tree of knowledge. So they were told the rules, they broke a rule, and then they're kicked out.
And then they're in this they're in this vortex of shame for eternity.
Yeah.
Right. And
we come into the world with sin, which I don't really like. Yeah, those things just don't work for me. And that's when I feel like this overlayment of the need to be able to control people for other purposes that maybe governments have, or maybe businesses have. It's a power grab.
Well, and I think that's I want to respond to something you just said about shame can turn into self-righteousness too, right?
As a kickback, I
am feeling shameful.
So now I need to be self-righteous all the way to the other side. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is really dangerous.
A certain amount of shame is useful as a learning tool. When you have a child that knows the rules, that lies or does something wrong, you can say that you're disappointed to invoke some shame in that child, and that is hopefully going to be enough to make them question themselves, feel something like I've let someone down, and make a readjustment.
But I think that's in a healthy,
that's what I said. It's dosage. You can't
and I think
crush
that
them.
Right. But I think and then somebody could get what you dose of shame, but it is internalized and it keeps growing.
Right.
So I'm a bad person. I was told I'm a bad person. I am a bad person, and they carry that with them instead of they some people will feel that they created some disappointment, and then they'll say I won't do that again, and I'll move forward.
They'll let it
some
go.
People just
and I think that happens in addiction too.
Yes,
people battling addictions. They're having backslides, they're falling off the wagon, they go through these cycles of feeling shame and feeling darkness and feeling not good enough, and then it puts them right back into the action that caused shame in the first place.
Well, and I think that is also, while I think recovery groups are a tremendous tool. I mean, from a community standpoint, there also can be situations where that community is very judgmental,
right.
and then that's not helping the person that's trying to walk that path.
Right.
If they, stray off of it.
Right. Right.
And in reality, this is a very, very strong community, and I want to be a part of it, and I don't want to be marginalized. But then there are other things going on with you physiologically,
right,
that may not allow you to follow that straight and narrow. But it's a disease of neurochemistry,
right,
and
right.
Addressing that piece and understanding that it's not an act of willpower to stop,
Right. And that shame is not going to be the thing that is going to allow healing.
Right.
Or
no, and shame is going to that can flip on itself in that situation, where it keeps the addict in a dark place and abusing or what have you.
Yeah, and then so wondering too if the addiction is actually a response to a deep wound
and
that is surrounded by shame.
Generally it is, yeah.
So, wow, that's complicated.
And then so then we think of culturally on a from our species standpoint, how do we recover from shame, right? If you think of recovery,
right,
and people coming out of an incarceration situation are more than likely carrying around post-traumatic stress syndrome with them, and that needs to be addressed. So there's, and what frightens me a little bit about the way we're living now is we're not experiencing deeper connections with each other.
Right.
That's being truncated.
Well, and that allows for empathy and compassion, and then we can forgive and we can see a whole person instead of a collection of their failures, faults, or flaws.
And I think that, you think of, let's just talk about, hypothetically, you had a really healthy society, right? Where everybody took accountability.
Right.
And everybody was empowered.
Right.
You can't control people that are empowered, right? There aren't any mechanisms to do that because they've already, they've come into themselves. The person that gives me hope is Brene Brown's research on shame and vulnerability, and that her message is being disseminated to millions of people.
Yeah.
And
on every level.
Yes, and I think that and the awareness that she's injected into our fabric is important.